Most people assume the rules of war are written after conflict's end, shaped by treaties and moral reflection. But in many cases, the rules emerge because ordinary soldiers, cold, exhausted, cut off, and desperate to survive, found methods that worked too well. Techniques born from necessity often blurred the line between survival and prohibition. They solved immediate problems but created long-term consequences that militaries and governments could not ignore. Some of the most effective survival practices of World War II were not battlefield strategies in the traditional sense. They were improvisations, practical responses to hunger, ambush, capture, and environmental collapse. Many saved lives in the moment. Yet many were later restricted or banned outright because they made war harder to control, harder to regulate, and harder to end. Understanding these methods reveals something deeper than tactical ingenuity. It reveals how survival pressures reshape morality, doctrine, and law itself. If you value this kind of serious historical analysis, subscribe to The Survival Record, because these overlooked realities tell us far more about war than official battle narratives ever could. Some soldiers survived by turning the landscape itself into a weapon through hidden explosive traps. Improvised booby traps became one of the most widespread survival adaptations of World War II. Tripwires attached to grenades pressure-triggered mines and disguised explosives hidden in abandoned equipment allowed small or isolated units to defend territory without direct engagement. In dense forests, ruined cities, and jungle terrain, these devices multiplied defensive power when manpower was limited. For soldiers facing the grim prospects of encirclement or retreat, booby traps served as force multipliers and psychological deterrents. You see, a single unit could delay entire advancing formations by simply making movement both dangerous and unpredictable. This clever tactic reduced direct combat exposure and conserved ammunition, both of which were essential survival concerns. However, the long-term consequences were, well, quite severe. Many traps remained active long after the combat had ended, tragically killing civilians and even the soldiers who had placed them. Post-war military doctrine increasingly restricted such uncontrolled deployment, emphasizing the importance of mapping, marking, and accountability. The lesson was unmistakably clear: survival tools that remain lethal indefinitely undermine not just the enemy, but also the stability that must follow war. Some troops managed to survive by cleverly disguising themselves in enemy uniforms, allowing them to move through hostile territory undetected. Infiltration through captured uniforms was not only tactically effective, but often life-saving. Cut off from supply lines or surrounded, soldiers sometimes relied on deception to escape, gather intelligence, or reposition without engagement. But this method directly violated long-standing conventions of war. The Hague regulations prohibited combatants from wearing enemy uniforms while fighting because it eroded the basic distinction between combatant and non-combatant identification. Once uniform recognition could no longer be trusted, the risk of misidentification escalated dramatically. Commanders feared a cascading effect. If disguise became normalized, every encounter would become suspect, and surrender itself could lose meaning. Survival gained through deception threatened the entire structure of battlefield recognition. Some units survived by modifying ammunition to inflict maximum incapacitation rather than standard battlefield wounds. Soldiers occasionally altered bullets, filing tips, reshaping jackets, or using unofficial ammunition to increase stopping power. In the close quarters of combat, especially in jungle or urban settings, the ability to incapacitate an opponent immediately was frequently more crucial than hitting a target at long range. You see, a wounded enemy who could still manage to return fire posed a grave threat. Modified ammunition, therefore, played a role in ending engagements more swiftly, helping to reduce prolonged exchanges that drained precious resources and exposed soldiers to unnecessary risk. Some soldiers found themselves having to survive by turning to improvised chemical irritants when standard weapons either failed or simply weren't available. They experimented with various smoke mixtures, fuel compounds, and materials that produced irritants to flush enemies out from enclosed spaces or well-defended positions. Now, it's important to note that these were not always formal chemical weapons programs. More often than not, they were improvised responses to fortified resistance, essentially an attempt to avoid direct assaults by making certain positions temporarily uninhabitable. But here's the thing, the Geneva Protocol had already laid down strong prohibitions against the use of chemical warfare. Even the limited or improvised use of such tactics carried the risk of escalation and potential retaliation. Some combat units survived by creating lethal anti-personnel terrain hazards that remained active without supervision. In the Pacific Theater especially, soldiers constructed concealed spikes, pit traps, and tension-triggered mechanisms designed to wound or immobilize advancing troops. Some soldiers survived capture by carrying poison to avoid interrogation entirely. Cyanide capsules and other self-administered poisons were carried by certain personnel who expected high risk of capture, especially intelligence operatives and resistance fighters. For them, survival was redefined. Some troops survived by deliberately contaminating resources to deny them to advancing forces. Scorched earth survival tactics often included poisoning wells, destroying food stores, or rendering infrastructure unusable before retreat. Some isolated units survived by taking food and shelter from civilians without formal requisition or compensation. In prolonged campaigns where supply chains collapsed, soldiers frequently depended on forced local provisioning. This ranged from informal confiscation to systematic seizure. These survival methods forced militaries to confront a difficult truth about war itself. Every one of these practices emerged from immediate necessity. None were theoretical. They were solutions created by people operating at the edge of endurance, cold, hungry, surrounded or cut off from command. Modern rules of engagement, weapons conventions, and military survival training are shaped not just by strategy, but by the accumulated memory of what happens when survival becomes the only guiding principle. Understanding these lesser-known realities matters because they reveal the true pressures that shape warfare. If you value deep, historically grounded analysis that explores what war actually does to human behavior, subscribe to The Survival Record. And, share this video with others who want to understand not just how wars are fought, but how survival reshapes the rules that govern them.